I'm glad to see everybody here. My name is Paul. Unless anybody has an objective, I would like to record this in audio version. It's for a book that I'm writing. I'm writing a book about morality and how to turn it into a science and the steps that we would take to do that. And I use these roundtable discussions and events and such to get feedback and to collect that data. And then I can go through, and when I find commonalities and stuff, I can maybe add that to an appendices, or I can write in, I can address it in the book itself or whatever. So does anybody have a problem with that? Is it okay if I record this audio only? Is that all right? Okay.
We're going to make both ways there, so.
Well, just want to make sure I have everybody's consent. And that way, if one of you says something especially brilliant, then I'm going to put it in my book. I'm going to steal it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So, this is a slide, actually, Science, Naturalism, Humanism, and Morality. This came off of American Humanist website. And morality there is defined in what I would call kind of a typical way, right? This is, obviously definitions are descriptive in nature, they're about common use. So that's not what morality means necessarily, but this is what most people think of when they think of morality. And it's interesting to me what's written there, and I can't quite see it, but it says principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior, and a particular system of values and principles of conduct, especially one held by a specific person or society. And you see definitions like this of morality all over the place. Here's another one, very similar. But notice in this definition, and I'll just read it aloud, the distinction between right and wrong or subjective assessment of either good or bad onto an action, thought, or belief. Now, as with the previous definition, it should be clear that most people think and use morality in terms of subjective, meaning this society has a morality and that society has a different morality, and I have a morality and you have a morality, and it might be different. But it doesn't tell us anything about how to figure out right from wrong. And it doesn't address anything about how, let's say you and I have differing moralities, and they're in conflict or they're contradictory. By definition, if we're in contradiction, one of us has to be wrong.
Or both.
Technically both, too. Yeah, and we don't know how to solve that. And none of the moral systems that we are privy to seem to have an answer for that either. So where do we start? That's really kind of the place I'd like to start at, is the beginning, right? So at first, we just have to realize that we have a lot of work ahead of us, right? We're not just going to walk out of this room with a full understanding, clarity in moral thought and moral methodology. But we can make some strides, right? And I already mentioned some of these things, right? We can't tell right from wrong in our current moral systems. It's all just he said, she said, or that's their culture, so that's why they do that. And we can't condemn or condone any behavior. And we don't have any real path. We don't have any direction, at least not now. There's not a system in place that tells us this is how we get from where we are to where we want to be, morally speaking. It's kind of just up to you, right? Or it's up to the culture you were raised in, or the indoctrinated religion that you were brainwashed into, or whatever it is, right? Whatever path you're on is largely your own, and most people, most of the time, don't even really feel comfortable challenging you. It's just that's how they are, right? I can't say they're good or bad. I wouldn't behave that way. They might say something like that. But they say, I'm not going to, that's their culture. Who am I to so-and-so? You've heard this, right? This all sounds familiar? So what I'd like to propose is that we make science out of morality. That we purposefully treat it as a science, and that we engage with it scientifically, and that we collect scientific data, and that we put it through the scientific method, and we subject it to peer review, and we find out what some of these answers really are. And then hopefully we could be smart enough to implement some of what we learn into our governmental documents, into our policies, and so on. So all of that is going to require soundness. We have to make sound moral decisions, and soundness is based on evidence. So as a new definition of what morality is, I would propose the following. It's an evidence-based system or methodology used to direct the thoughts, feelings, and actions of Homo sapiens towards promoting human flourishing while avoiding or diminishing human suffering. As a starting off point, there are a couple things to note here. We're going to be using evidence that's in the definition. That was lacking in all the other definitions. There's no word of evidence. There's no relation to evidence in any of the other definitions. The other is we're going to be using a methodology, specifically the scientific method. And this pertains to Homo sapiens. I use that word very specifically. That was picked because that does not leave anybody out. Everybody's Homo sapiens, right? If you've noticed in some of our documents, they say things like, we the people. But it doesn't say what a people is. It doesn't say what a person is. It doesn't say who it pertains to. And in fact, in that document, the one I'm referring to, if my memory serves, sometimes I get the three mixed up, the three founding documents. But it doesn't distinguish what a person is, but it absolutely distinguishes what a person isn't, specifically African Americans. They're not people in that document. They're only 3/5 of a person. And that math is never made right. There's nowhere in that document that says we were wrong and they're actually people, or what a person is, or how we can determine what a person is. So it's important that we make sure we know what we're talking about here. We set the scope, right? So at its very least, and I'll add on to this, a sound moral system does not promote suffering. That's probably important to say, right? And that's in relation and response to a lot of sort of philosophers and those types of folks that like to say morality is a philosophy. So they say something like, oh, well, this is just, and then they pull out philosophy jargon. This is just deontological morality, mixed in with utilitarianism or whatever. And there's all this baggage that comes with that. So I'm just further honing this definition to give some clarity. And at its very best, a science of morality promotes intellectual honesty and integrity, and we'll talk about those words specifically, where all of our thoughts and beliefs and actions are in alignment with the moral evidence that we have available. So that's a tall order. But I think that if this was a system that we were to implement, we could potentially achieve that. I mean, we have a system right now that's pretty good at determining the shape of the Earth, and still not everybody's in line, right? Some people still fumble that question. So I don't have delusions about what we're going to accomplish with a science of morality, but I would like to at least try, right? I think it's worth the doing. Science generally seems to be worth the doing. When we were asking, well, why would we go to the moon? What's on the moon? Well, as it turns out, a lot of that science ended up giving us the internet. A lot of those physicists decided, well, let's just build an internet so we can talk to each other quickly and easily, right? It's worth the doing, even if it doesn't seem like it right away, even if we can't convince a politician. So I understand there are some vague terms here, and I want to make sure that we bring clarity to terms like integrity, or human flourishing, or suffering, right? And we can address those in detail, but recognize, in order to understand what those words mean, the vague parts, the only way to get there is science. How are we ever going to decide what is suffering without a method like science? After all, the scientific method is the only way to understand anything. Name another path to truth. And for some reason, whatever reason, we are not subjecting morality to that path, to that methodology. We're just saying I'm moral, or I'd like to be moral, or I know I did something I probably shouldn't have done, but I did it because of this, so now it's justified, and so on. And it's all messy, right? Everything's a pain. It's all a pain in the ass. Pardon me. But I think we can subject it to science, and I think we should, and I think even the going through of it, even if we have a lot of detractors, would probably bring us to something of benefit. So I just want to put you there. Now, before I move on and give you just, I mean, this is as basic as it gets. And believe me, this crowd is beyond and above all this. For the most part, I know who I'm talking to, but not everybody is as savvy as you guys. And so sometimes I have to make things like ultra basic, right? Because some people believe the earth is flat or whatever, right? Some people need some real work to get just to the basics. So some of this you're going to look at and go, well, duh, right? And I apologize. I'm not trying to talk down to you, but I am trying to bring this to the masses. So before we move on to the moral continuum, which is just a visual representation of my definition and what I just said, and it's just to give something you in your mind to see when you think of the definition. Do you guys have any questions, or is there anything you don't like about the what I've said so far, or whatever? Yes, sir.
Yes. So when you talk about science, how do you define science? The science of politics, the science, engineering type science, technical?
Well, we're going to talk about exactly what kinds of sciences and how science can reflect on morality, but I mean, I define science just like everybody else defines science. It's a methodology for understanding the truth and gaining knowledge. It has multiple branches. It's physics and chemistry and biology and psychology and neurology and all that, physiology. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Discovering the truth.
Yeah, it's
the truth.
I would say it's the methodology for discovering truth.
Good.
Or gaining knowledge, representing and modeling reality. There's a lot of different ways you could say that. Some people don't like that word truth. I just did a presentation on truth yesterday, and some people, I'm not going to say who, didn't love the everything I said, right? Yes, sir.
My understanding is you're making as a basic assumption, which I think shared in this room very much, that science is the only and best way to gain knowledge and be accurate. But there are an awful lot of people that say poetry, fine art,
Sure.
music, that's the way you get to real truth.
Sure. Is there a question, or do you want to just make a statement?
I think that getting to the truth, there are multiple pathways according to quite a few people. I disagree, but that's the way.
No, I understand. And to them, I would probably say, okay, well, poetry, your way to the moon. Show me how your music or art or what was the other one you said?
Music
or religion or belief
no, I didn't
or whatever.
Say religion.
Love, right?
But I did say poetry, and people say
Poetry.
that's the way you get to the true soul of a human being.
Sure.
That's all this scientific stuff about how the gut works, how the brain
Oh, no,
works.
yeah. I understand. No, to be clear, not everybody's going to be on board with this right away.
Almost
In fact-
nobody, let me put it more strongly.
Almost nobody?
I think that, and especially
Maybe get to the end of the
last 10
presentation
years,
before
science
you
is being
decide it's not gonna
declining
work.
Very much in the public perceptions.
Only in the United States. There's a whole other world out there that embraces science much, much more than we do. But no, I take your point. This is not an easy road. I have not aimed low and then overachieved. I've aimed really high, and I'm probably going to fail. But we'll get to that. We'll get to my failure later. So now we have a definition that identifies that to be moral, we are going to have to engage in a method, and I talked about this a little bit already. This method is going to be based in evidence. Just belaboring some of this. To help us conceptualize this a little better, let's consider this moral continuum that you see here. On the left, we have suffering. On the right, we have flourishing. And in the middle, there's you, right? Or humanity, or Homo sapiens, or your mother, or your kids, or whatever, whoever, right? And at its most basic, morality does relate to the individual, but whole groups of people, because we're all the same thing, can be put into that place. I just put you in there because people think about themselves a lot. So you could put yourself right there. It's easier than if I put your mom, right? Or whatever. No matter who we put in this place, the goal is always the same. To move Homo sapiens away from suffering and towards flourishing through our thoughts, feelings, and actions. And I already sort of asked, but I was fielding other questions. Is everybody comfortable with this definition? Does this sound like morality to people?
I was,
Yes.
I think you're restrictive on morality, because what if we met aliens, or whether it's
Oh,
okay
sure.
to torture animals, or
No,
whatever.
that's a very good
I
point.
don't like restricting it. to
No, and
humans.
I restrict it only for the purpose of the book, only for the scope that I'm now appealing to Homo sapiens. After we figure out how to treat each other, and how to implement moral systems, and how to have a science of morality, I would love to open it up to chimps and the great apes in general, and probably orca, and anything else that we feel like we want to. I mean, you're allowed to. There's nothing in here that says you can't apply your moral ethic that you learned from science to a mouse or whatever you want. Something that has an experience, something that's alive, or something that suffers or flourishes. There's no reason why you wouldn't do that.
But you're defining morality as Homo sapiens.
I'm going to focus on Homo sapiens.
But that's not a whole definition of morality, that's a limited definition.
Yes, but I'm limiting it on purpose. Just to be clear, I'm limiting it on purpose because I want to deal with that first. Like, I don't want to sit in a room, no offense, I don't want to sit in a room and talk about mice or whales or whatever. Let's figure out the human part first, and then let's start adding things in. That'll be another book. This is this book. This book is the human book, and then the other book is, okay, now what do we do with whales or whatever, right? That's just for the book. But I understand your point, and I don't think it has to be. I think the definition, once understood and once the science is developed, opens up to anything that suffers and flourishes, including aliens, assuming that they suffer and flourish for the same reasons. Yes, sir.
I think empathy is an important part of all this.
It certainly is. Yes, sir.
Yeah, but you just talked about thoughts. I think empathy is a thought.
Sure it is, but that covers it then, doesn't it? Thoughts, feelings.
Well, you
We
can
will
have
talk
bad
about...
thoughts too, so.
Oh, certainly that, yes. And you can empathize with bad people, which is a lot of what happens. But we are going to actually specifically address empathy. It's going to be a little bit covert, but when we talk about how to collect subjective evidence in a scientific way, we'll be talking about empathy.
So are you using suffering and flourishing as endpoints or standards that are a priority, good or bad? A priority,
I
good or
think
bad,
so,
but
yeah. I mean, I think you could say that, sure.
I was just looking at it, and in my mind, I'm going, flourishing or suffering are not necessarily good or bad themselves. Flourishing humans, overpopulation. Suffering humans.
But flourishing doesn't mean populating. It's not necessarily what that means. And science doesn't mean, when we go into the science, it doesn't necessarily, the outcome of our scientific investigation isn't going to be the more people that there are, the more flourishing there is. That's not necessarily the case. We don't know what the answers are yet. This is just a framework for how to collect the information so that we can come to moral conclusions.
So we have to restrict those terms as well.
Probably. There's a lot of work to be done, for sure. Are we ready to?
Yes, please.
Okay. So what are some benefits of this definition? Well, and this isn't a benefit for you necessarily, but it could be opened up. I just want to make that clear. I do take your point, and I agree with you. But just for the focus of the book and for this presentation, it is focused on Homo sapiens. It's not vague in the way that those other definitions were vague, in the way that our Constitution is vague, for instance. It relies on evidence. That's huge. It's scientific in nature and copies the scientific method. And it's flexible enough to include all of humanity. We're not going to be 3/5thing anybody out of this. We wouldn't have any cause or reason to do that. We wouldn't have any evidence to demonstrate that we should do that. So now that we've discussed evidence, I want to talk a little bit about the two different kinds of evidence that we're going to collect and how we can do all this. So there's evidence of the hard sciences, right? And evidence like physiological science that tells us about the human body, neurology tells us about our brain and so on. There's hard science evidence that we can draw from. There's brain imaging and so on. But we're all human beings. We're all Homo sapiens. So we have the unique ability to vocalize how we feel. And that is, by definition, a subjective data point. Your account of your suffering or flourishing is subjective. and we should collect that from people as part of this process. And in that way, we can align our moral thoughts, beliefs, and actions with both objective moral evidence, like the facts of neurology or physiology or biology. But we can also include something like subjective moral evidence, like your experience of flourishing, to have a real full picture, morally speaking, of what it is that we should do and why. And we're gonna get to a real specific example. So I know you're all just like, how do we get there? We'll get there. And the outcome would be that because we're using evidence, we achieve intellectual integrity, meaning that our beliefs align with evidence. We don't have any beliefs that don't align with evidence. And we engage with this morality just like we do science and discover moral truths. So this has some real benefit to it. We could actually get somewhere with this. So what does some of this evidence look like? So this is Pew data. Now, this is just a visual representation of what a moral data set might look like. I want to be very clear here that the question they're asking, do you think abortion should be legal in all cases, legal in most cases, illegal in most cases, or illegal in all cases? That is a moral question, but it's not being asked in the correct way. And I'll explain that in just a moment. There's a lot of noise in this data, and I want to point that out. But this is what a moral data set might look like. And I know you guys know what data looks like. But I wanted to show you this. The answer to these questions are surprisingly simple if we use the methodology that I outline in this book. And we're just going to focus on the evidence and the science. I call these human data sets in the book. They could be called moral data sets or whatever, but I call them human data sets. And this is Pew's attempt to collect such data. And you've seen data like this before. But as I mentioned, this data isn't sound. I'll explain why shortly. But if you look at this data, this is what different countries think about the legality of abortion. But this doesn't tell us how we should think. This doesn't give us any information about what our conclusion about abortion should be. This doesn't help us come to a conclusion about abortion. This just tells us how either moral or immoral these countries are, right? We have a country like, I don't know which one is immoral. There's one that says 58 illegal in all cases. That's Indonesia. That sounds like me saying Indonesia is immoral in the case of abortion because 58, I guess, percentage of them think it should be illegal in all cases. But it doesn't tell me what I should think. And it doesn't tell me how to get to what I should think. So this data, while it does help you if you're a person who happens to be able to get pregnant and you might not want to carry it to term, this might help you figure out where you want to live, right? But it doesn't tell you, should you get an abortion? It doesn't tell you, is abortion moral or immoral? Is this decision appropriate or not, right? It doesn't tell you any of that. And this is largely the kind of moral data we're collecting. It's just filled with noise. It does have a purpose, don't get me wrong, but this is subjective moral data that's collected, and it's got a lot of bias and bigotry, and it's got a lot of false belief, and it's baked into it because of the way they ask the question. We'll talk about the right question in a minute. Let's talk about objective moral facts real quick. So, a human data set filled with objective moral facts. It's an objective moral fact that to flourish, human beings must breathe. Homo sapiens breathe, it's a fact of our physiology. If a human stops breathing or is forced to stop breathing, they'll suffer. That's a physiological fact.
Shortly.
And they'll die, which is what I would call ultimate suffering, right? And sorry?
I just said for shortly they'll suffer and then they'll die and then they don't suffer anymore.
Correct. They'll suffer so much that they die from it. Again, this is an objective scientific fact.
No. If you put them to sleep immediately and then they die thereafter, no suffer. You put them to sleep like that.
Well, they'll die, and that
They'll
is
die,
suffering.
But there's no, well, if you're defining death as suffering,
Well, we'll get there.
okay.
We'll get there. But these are scientific facts. The physiological facts of human respiration are a fine example of objective moral facts that we would use and include in our data system and in our morality to determine how we should act and how we should behave and how we should think. And this is a hard science. It's very firmly understood, and how the human body responds when it's in a situation where it's lacking oxygen versus when it has plenty of oxygen. And this is all measurable. We even have a little thing that goes on your finger and says how much oxygen is in your blood right this second. I mean, that's how much access we have to this data. So this kind of data, this kind of objective data, gives us a lot of parameters from which to work with, morally speaking. We can use oxygen and the reality of human respiration to cause flourishing, or we could use it to cause suffering. And in the case of this person, they used it to cause suffering. And this is how George Floyd was murdered. Notice that what happened to George Floyd is completely reproducible. It could happen to any of us. Under the same circumstances, the exact same thing would happen. You would suffer and you would die. And we could predict this. It's very, very predictable. And that is one of the key elements of science. Can you reliably predict suffering or flourishing in a Homo sapiens? That's how I know morality is a science. Because I can. I could do this to any of you, or I wouldn't, of course, but this could happen to any of you, and it would happen the exact same way, in the exact same situation, and you'd suffer and you'd die. And it would be every single, there's no example where this wouldn't be the case. The opposite's also true. We could flourish reliably and predictably, right? With good, clean air that has plenty of oxygen in it. I mean, these are this is a fact of chemistry, right? There's a chemistry involved in our atmosphere that provides flourishing for humanity. And we can adjust that chemistry, and we are, for the worse, as it turns out. So, some of you might be asking, well, why was this immoral? And I would answer that it's immoral because George Floyd suffered. We know that something is immoral when someone suffers. We know when something is moral when someone flourishes. We can ask people if they're suffering. In this case, he might have been able to answer us, although I think in the picture on the right, he is already deceased, which is too bad. But we can take his vitals. We can determine how much he suffered and for how long and everything else. And like I said, this is all reproducible. This is all very scientific. Falsifiable, reproducible, verifiable, to peer review. We could put that through the scientific method and we could get the same answer. We could get a very predictable answer every single time. And that's very scientific. Let's see.
I got
Yeah, please.
you're talking physical suffering here and stuff. I'll just throw out a quick example here. Rudy Giuliani is suffering big time.
Sure.
Does he deserve it? What he did to those clerks and what's happening? Is that immoral to do that to him, to make him suffer after what he did to other people?
Well, when you say deserve it, there isn't a lot of room for what you deserve in science. If we're going to talk about a science of morality, the question is Rudy Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani, is he suffering? And is this needless suffering? Like, why is he suffering? Is it really necessary that Rudy needs to suffer too? Like, how many people need to suffer in order to make the suffering of another person justifiable or warranted, or does he deserve it? I mean, if we can nullify the situation and engineer a scientific solution so that Rudy Giuliani is not causing people to suffer and he himself is not suffering, that's a better outcome. That's a better moral outcome.
I'll go along with that, yeah.
Sure. But does he deserve it? I mean, that sounds like it's...
Is his
that sounds
suffering moral or immoral?
Well, if it's suffering, so it's immoral.
Okay.
That's what I would say. I mean, if you cause suffering, if a system or an institution that we have causes suffering, it's an immoral institution. It's an immoral action or immoral thought or belief, especially when we have a way, science, to engineer a system that doesn't generate suffering, even as a response to suffering. Like, you know, Giuliani, I don't know exactly what you're referring to, but Giuliani caused suffering and he's being punished, right?
Yeah, he's losing everything he owns.
Okay, yeah, okay.
It's mental suffering.
I'm
It's
getting
not
more
physical.
familiar with what you're saying. Yeah, I don't care that much about Giuliani, but I understand what you're saying. And what I mean is I don't like follow the news to find out what's happened to him today. But no, if there's a way to resolve the issue and eliminate suffering, the only way to find out how to do that is through science. The only way, and we need to try to engineer that system. Right now we have sort of a lot of, well, good enough for now types of solutions that we haven't scienced our way out of yet. And people want to, you know, well, but that guy's a murderer, he should be in jail, and I don't care if he suffers and stuff like that. And that's okay to say that if that's what you want to say, but it's probably better if we engineer a way where that person doesn't suffer. And maybe they actually thrive. Yes, sir.
Do you consider pain to be suffering?
That would be, yeah, that's generally yes. I mean, the physiological facts of pain are that it causes suffering, but here's where we would want subjective data as well.
Well,
To back that
I
up.
would argue that biologically, pain is a very important positive, not a negative. That if you bump up as a child against a hot stove and burn your hand, you have learned and
Sure.
So suffering can be, in pain in particular,
Sure.
can be an essential, not a bad, an essential positive to
But
human.
but if there's one good thing about science is that it takes the things we inherited from our evolutionary past, and it helps alleviate the parts we don't like about it, the parts that cause us suffering, right? So if you can get pregnant, you're going to suffer during that pregnancy. That's part of being pregnant. But thanks to science, you can now take a drug during the delivery that eases that pain, it eases that suffering. If the goal is to ease the pain and suffering, which I think it should be, generally speaking, and this is a little bit more general, like if you were to ask somebody, do you want this pain, and they said yes, now you've got a subjective data point that allows for that pain. But generally speaking, I mean, yeah, pain's not good, it's bad for you, it hurts, and enough of it will cause you to die. And yes, it does have an evolutionary past, but recognize that if you say because it's what evolved into us, it's how we evolved that makes it good, you run the risk of the naturalistic fallacy, but I mean, I'm not convinced that the naturalistic fallacy is really that big of a deal. It kind of runs in one direction and not the other. But anyway, we don't have any choice in whether or not we feel pain. We feel pain. What we do have a choice in is whether we want to continue to feel pain, right?
Sometimes.
And the science of the matter is how do we engineer systems where we can minimize pain for those that want it, is what I would say. Does that answer your question? I take your point, but
Yeah, I disagree, but I understand.
yeah, okay. Well, you certainly wouldn't prescribe pain for people that don't want it, just because this
I think it
is
is
good for you whether
prescribed.
you want it or not. You will put your hand on that stove. You wouldn't do that, right?
Now, our evolutionary heritage requires and gives pain a very prominent, positive place. That's all I'm saying.
Well, and the science vets that out. But again, you wouldn't hold a child's hand on the stove.
No.
No. And if you saw a child reaching for a white hot stove, you wouldn't just bite your tongue. You'd go, please don't. And maybe show them a different way that doesn't cause pain that's hot. You'd engineer a solution where the child doesn't burn the tip of his finger off. Right? I mean, I understand your point, but just because something evolved into us doesn't mean we don't have a reason to solve that. I mean, we evolved into the food chain. We engineered our way out of it. That was a good thing. I like going to the supermarket. I don't like being chased by lions on my way there either. And I don't want to have to chase down a baby something so that I can eat this morning. You get my point. I get your point too. I take your point that a lot of the science is going to be, I mean, we're going to have to look at it long and hard and really do a lot of this work. There's a lot of work ahead of us. So another place where I found some objective moral facts and some really well articulated subjective moral facts was in a book called A Child Called It. Is anybody here familiar with this book? Okay, it's a book where David Pelzer is the author. That's him. He was the child. And this is the worst, or maybe close to the worst, child abuse case in the history of California. So this is essentially a first-person account of David's abuse that he was subject to from the time he was born to the time he was 11, brought to him by his mother. Specifically, I already said that, okay. This book provides us with a lot of objective science and a lot of objective data points to demonstrate that what happened to him was immoral. But it's also a fantastic source of subjective moral facts. So let's start with a little bit of objective moral facts, and then we'll get on to some subjective. So let's talk about bruising for a second. These bruises can be counted and measured and assessed for severity and depth and so on. That's objective. That's science. It can be subject to peer review in case there's any question about how big or small or sensitive these bruises are. And that's David, by the way. That's all verifiable, it's all peer reviewable, it's all up to the scientific method to determine exactly what kinds of bruises these are and so on. And this is reproducible. This is predictable. I could do the exact same thing to anybody in this room. Anybody could do this to another person or another child, very predictably. If you hit somebody in the exact same place on their cheek, with the exact same amount of force, with the exact same type of object, the exact same thing will happen. Now, any prediction in science is going to have a little bit of error, right? You're going to predict it, and to a certain percentage, you're going to be correct. But that doesn't mean that we throw our hands up and say, well, you know, I could hit you with a bat and you wouldn't even feel it. It's like, come on. We know the physiological side effects of blunt force trauma. And thankfully, I mean, kind of not thankfully, but kind of thankfully, we don't have to reproduce this to determine that this is what's going to happen. I mean, it's already done for us. There's plenty of bad people out there, and we have plenty of this happening. So we don't have to take it into a lab and say, okay, time to hit the kids again, right? We don't have to do that, thankfully, but again, kind of not thankfully, because there's a lot of bad people out there doing it for us. And I'm not very thankful for that. So in this following account, these are his own words now. This is his subjective account of a specific event. So she put a bucket, and this is him talking now, filled with a mixture of ammonia and Clorox in a room with me and closed the door. I was ignorant about what was going to happen. Only when Mother closed the door and ordered me not to open it did I begin to worry. As I breathed in the fumes, I collapsed and began spitting out. My throat felt like it was on fire. Within minutes, it was raw. And the gas from the reaction of the ammonia and Clorox mixture made my eyes water. I was frantic. I thought I would cough up my insides. I felt as if I were locked in a gas chamber. I coughed up blood for over an hour. Of all my mother's punishments, I hated the gas chamber game, is what she called it, the most. So later, in response to this torture, David would say, inside, my soul became so cold that I hated everything. I even despised the sun, for I knew I would never be able to play in its warm presence. I cringed with hate everywhere I heard other children laughing and playing outside. My stomach coiled whenever I smelled food that was about to be served to somebody else because I knew it wasn't for me. So here we have a subjective account and real powerful words. Now, these are examples of the kind of subjective moral data that we would collect from people. And we would collect these into our human data sets and query those data sets to determine how to behave and how to think and how to feel about this. This is how subjective moral data helps us in the science of morality. And it's because we have an experience as Homo sapiens of our suffering and of our flourishing, and it's worth collecting. It's worth including everybody in this in this system and capturing that data. It's worth the going through of it to determine how people want to be treated. Make no mistake though, just because this is subjective data does not mean that it's unscientific. Anybody going through what David went through would have this happen to them, and they would respond with something similar. It's a fact of chemistry. If you breathe that mixture, you will suffer. And your account of that suffering is going to be in alignment with anybody's account of that suffering. You're going to talk about burning, you're going to talk about blood, you're going to talk about coughing, you're going to talk about breathing, and so on. And this is all, like I said, producible, reproducible, falsifiable, up to peer review, and very, very predictable. As all good science is, right? All good science has those qualities. So, let's see. And there's one thing I want to say right now, okay? So, no matter what your moral system is, no matter what you think about what happened to David, there is no way for you to talk this away. There's no way for you to subjectively spin this into a good thing. This is irrefutable evidence and facts of his suffering and the detriment of his body and his mind. His subjective account is indisputable. You do not have anything you could say or do. There's no moral system that you could take on as your own personal one to make this okay, or better said, to make this a good thing or moral. This is suffering, period. There is nothing you could say. There's no argument you could bring that would change the facts of what happened to David and how he perceived those things. And that's indisputable. So, before we move on to the slightly next aspect of this, let's take a deep breath, right? That was a lot of ugly pictures and ugly words. Not all of morality is ugly. It generally hits the hardest though, so I start with it. There's a lot of positive aspects to this that we could get into. Human flourishing is just as much of an aspect of a morality as suffering is. But suffering tends to get people's attention, unfortunately. But let's hear from the room. Does anybody have anything to say, or is this uncomfortable? I mean, are you okay? How are you?
Question.
Yes.
I'm doing okay. So in history, like when we look at world wars,
Sure.
when we look at genocides,
Indeed.
in Africa, wherever you can think of a place,
Yeah.
you've had genocide.
Take a
there.
step on the
Where
land.
have we
What's happened
learned?
there?
That's science.
I'm sorry, say that
That
again?
is science.
What is science?
That genocide, that people suffered and died.
Indeed.
You're right. So where have we learnt as Homo sapiens of this suffering? Where have we learned to make changes to this morality?
Well, I think that's why I'm encouraging us to make a science of it, because largely I think we've spun our wheels. I don't think we are learning as quickly as we could be.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of morally good people. I think a lot of people would deny, or maybe deny isn't the right word, but would reject a command to murder, or they would vote against a genocide or whatever. But I think there's also a lot of people that morally don't know how to behave or what to think. And a good scientifically written book with real conclusions and demonstration of what the actual answer is would be beneficial to those folks. I think it would be reaffirming to the folks that are morally sound in their thinking, that recognize suffering as what it is and recognize flourishing for what it is, and recognize that things like war are probably pretty obsolete. We might have a way to get what we want and work together as opposed to murdering each other in times of conflict. But I think that's part of the reason why I'm writing the book and why I publish my podcast and the other stuff that I put out there, is because it does seem like people are kind of lost. I mean, when you look at that initial definition, even a good moral person sees that and goes, yeah, that looks about right. It has no direction. It doesn't talk about evidence. It doesn't talk about Homo sapiens. It doesn't talk about methodology. It's just whatever I think is right is right. And I think a lot of people are kind of in that sort of holding pattern. And I'm not judging them. I'm just saying I think we could help direct people towards something sound.
And how do we perpetuate that from generation to generation moving forward?
Well, the same way we do it with science. We write a book about it and we teach it to them, you know? Hi, welcome. Please. Were there any other comments? Yes.
Yeah, so where can you go in a society where a significant proportion of us believe in a sky daddy or deity that invented
Yeah.
and patented
Yeah.
the infinite suffering, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And those people that follow that are okay with it.
Yeah.
They've somehow squared that circle and said,
Well,
yeah, that makes sense to me,
it-
that somebody that doesn't follow this rule book should suffer for eternity. And they're okay with it. They're like, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think we can underestimate humanity's ability to engage in bloodlust and to engage in cruelty. I don't think it's possible for us to just science our way out of that aspect of who we are.
Yeah.
We really are pretty much chimpanzees still. And we really do I even enjoy watching my enemies suffer to some degree. To some degree, I'll give you an example. I could hold up two different politicians, a picture in one hand and a picture in the other, and they're diametrically opposed. And I could guarantee that I could show what these two pictures, and everybody, 100% of people, would feel good if one of them suffered and would try to not have the other one suffer, right? If they saw one of them get shot, they'd be like, well, I don't love shooting people, but I'm kind of glad they're gone, right? That's not uncommon, and it's not uncommon for people, but that's the science tells us that, and more science, the better. Why are we so obsessed with bloodlust? Why do we enjoy watching our enemies suffer and so on? And how do we engineer a system out of it? That's what I'm proposing here. That the science is the key still, but the answer that I like to think is, if you have sound moral principles, and if you follow a system like the one I'm talking about, and that's the one I try to follow, I look at my political enemy and I think, okay, I don't feel bad that they're dead, right? They were a monster. But if that person, whichever picture you have in your mind, the politician you hate, if they were to approach me and say, I heard about this pandemic, should I wear a mask? I'd say, yeah, you should. I'd say, I have one. Do you want one? I'm going to be a human being with them. They're Homo sapiens. They deserve that. We talked about that word. I don't love that word, but I'll use it here for this. I have a moral obligation to help them and protect them and to guide them. And if they want to live and they're asking me, how do I do that? Then I say, here, this is how you do it. I have that responsibility, right? Even though I know that they're my enemy, and maybe an enemy to humanity, they're still a part of humanity. That's a part of who we are. Some of us are evil. Some of us are stupid. Some of us are poorly educated. There's a lot of reasons why somebody makes bad decisions, and I'm not convinced that we should be destroying our enemies as much as we should be converting them.
Oh, I agree.
I'm not sure, though, what the solution is, but if one of these two politicians approached me, either of them actually, whether I like them or not, and said, what should I do? We're in a pandemic. Should I wear a mask? I'd say, yes, you should. You should wear a mask, and you should get your children in masks, and you should probably shave so the mask makes a good tight fit around your face so that it doesn't get under the mask. Like, do all the things, read the CDC website, go to the part where it says what doctors should be doing, and mimic that. Don't put on booties, but put on the mask, put on the gloves, whatever, right? Does that answer your question? We are going to experience bloodlust. What do is you try to reason with people, you try to morally connect with them so that they see, oh, you care about me.
Right.
Maybe I should care too.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you're already predisposed to a story,
Yeah.
you've invested your whole life in that story, and your whole social structure
Yeah.
is built around that story
Yeah.
and belief of that story. Science doesn't matter to those people.
No, you're right.
They don't care.
But they
care
won't
about the
benefit from
narrative.
it.
And they feel it's their moral obligation to spread that.
Yeah.
Right.
It's their narrative.
But they will benefit from science. The good thing about
Oh, they
science...
do all the time, yeah.
The good thing about science is that it kind of goes on in the background whether you like it or not. Once it becomes established, people become sort of a part of an engine that moves along in the background. Now, it can be stifled through you know, certain movements or political, you know, opposition or whatever, but the science still goes on in the background. So once it's established and it's moving, the gears are working, a lot of the times that science will maintain its course whether or not people will care about it or not. I mean, I love science. I love cosmology. I couldn't tell you what the latest paper said because I didn't read it. I'm not in it right now. I'm focusing on this. I'm doing, you know, I got a dog. We go to the park. There's a lot of stuff that we do. I love cosmology though. Big Bang cosmology is one of my favorite topics of all time. And I have a whole chapter about it in my book. But I don't, you know, I don't care like in the sense that I'm on top of it. But I take your point. I mean, what do? We do the best we can. We try to reason with them, and we set up a society where they can be successful too. It's going to be really hard to deny my moral science when you're directly benefiting from it. I mean, there will be deniers. There are still people that think the Earth is flat. There are deniers, but hopefully through sound science and meaningful direction, we get to a place where people that deny science of morality are like flat earthers. You know, yeah, they have a convention, but nobody listens to them, or hopefully, you know, I mean, in this country, maybe. Yeah.
So when you talked about your these two people, one you dislike, one you like, but if they needed a mask,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
would offer either of them.
Oh, both.
Is that, yes, and you do that because of your own morality?
I do that because of the science of morality.
Yes.
They demonstrate
yes.
their Homo sapiens, and if I don't help them, they'll suffer.
So, but what about, isn't that integrity? For example, you could turn a blind eye to that one time or something like that?
Well, I mean, I talk about integrity and intellectual integrity and moral integrity in the book.
Okay.
We talked about it very briefly. I mentioned it.
Okay.
But by coming into alignment with the science of morality, you come into alignment with this integrity as well.
Okay.
I mean, you can't reasonably reject somebody just because you don't like them, in other words, right? I mean, they're Homo sapiens.
Okay.
And as a moral person following a science of morality, you would be obligated to help them flourish. Especially, I mean, you could get into some interesting moral calculations if you're maybe not helping them, but they didn't ask you, or you know what I mean? Like there are some things you could tweak a little bit, and maybe, I mean, that's one of the weird things about morality, especially philosophy, is people tweak it all the time. You hear the trolley problem and they say, well, what if the one guy's Hitler and the other guy's your mom or whatever, right? Like there's all these tweaks that they make to tweak your intuitions, but I'm trying to cleanse it of intuition as much as possible and ground it in the science.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the idea anyway. So how many of you are from, is it time to move on? Should we move on to the next slide? Okay. So how many of you are familiar with the golden rule? Probably quite a few of you.
The
Okay,
newer
so-
version is better.
I'm sorry?
The newer version is better.
What, sorry?
The newer version.
What's the newer version?
The newer version does not say that you do to something that you would like. If I like somebody to play me loud music, that doesn't mean I should play loud music to them. So that it's reversed the other way.
It's, that's the next slide.
Okay,
You got it figured out already. You're already 2 slides ahead of us, dude. Come on, give me a break.
I apologize.
No, that's fantastic. I'm glad people are jumping ahead. That means this is making sense. We need to figure out though, let's address that idea of subjective moral data. How do we collect subjective moral data that isn't filled with noise? Remember that data we looked at, that Pew data? It had all that noise in it. It had all that bias and bigotry baked into it. And it didn't tell us what to do. It didn't tell us how to behave or what to think. So we want to get to these indisputable facts like the ones we've described, the child called it, David, and the others. It's going to take a slight shift in your thinking, and you're already ahead of us, so that's good. But right now, we largely collect data based on the golden rule, and I think that's bad. That's a bad idea. I think we should ask questions a different way. But let's just ask a quick question the way we ask it now. So we ask now a question in this way. We say, what do you think should happen to those people? Right? That's how we ask moral questions right now. That's how that other one was asked. It said something about abortion and should it be illegal, but it didn't say, are you pregnant? It said, what do you think should happen to these pregnant people? Right? Or these unborn people. There were people that aren't born yet. They're people too, and what should happen to them? So we're now prescribing morality onto others. And as long as we're collecting data, that's probably not the way to go. So I'm going to take a minute just to look at this Pew poll here. Do you favor or oppose the death penalty for persons convicted of murder? I think it's implied in here that you're not convicted of murder. This is a golden rule question. What do you think should happen to those people? It's a real quick, just demonstration. Let me ask you an appropriate question. If you were convicted of murder and you did commit the murder, should you be put to death? By a raise of hands. Who believes they should be put to death if they murder? Is anybody in line? No? Okay, so we just did a Pew poll, right? We just did one based on the correct standard. And notice I asked you what should happen to you if you are in the group of people that are affected by the question. Remember that. So this one tells us what postgrads think and what Republicans think and what Democrats think or whatever. And all this tells me is how immoral or moral these people are, right? It doesn't tell me how I should think. So let's tweak the question. Do unto others as they would have you do unto them, right? And this does something very important that the other question doesn't. Or the other rule, if you want to call it, whatever. This is how we collect accurate moral data, subjective moral data, that does not have that bias or that bigotry or that noise in it. Because it focuses on asking somebody what should happen to you, right? So by changing the focus of the question and making it so that we reach out into the world and ask people how they want to be treated instead of treating them how we think we want to be treated, we get a better answer. And how is it better? Okay. Like I said, it reaches out into the world. We don't just suppose we know the answer. We're not reflecting internally to determine what other people think. We actually ask them what they think or what they want for themselves. It also solicits answers that can be used to direct our actions and our thoughts and our beliefs in this sound moral system that we're compiling, right? There's no bias because they're not talking about anybody other than themselves. You're getting the real answer of what they think should happen to people who are convicted of murder in the case of the question we just asked. People like themselves, right? Because everybody's willing to give somebody else the death penalty, nearly. I'm not, but a lot of people are. But most people, and this room was a good demonstration of that, would not do that to themselves. That's not how they want to be treated, right? And that makes that data that we collect, although it's subjective, it makes it scientific. Because once we collect it and aggregate it, then I can query that data and find out what percentage of people actually want to be murdered when they're caught murdering. That's really the data we want. Not what you think should happen to a murderer. You might be biased against murderers. I mean, that sounds funny when you say it like that, but you might be. What should happen to you if you murder? So, we already talked about this, right? This is the actual way to ask the question.
I have a question again.
Yes, please.
So when you asked us that question, no one puts up their hands because we have learnt or we have over time decided or live in a society that says, yeah, we don't want to murder people, we'd rather rehabilitate them. So now we've got this moral, if you will, that
Sure.
So yeah, we don't want to die ourselves, but we also don't want others to die.
Correct.
Well, isn't that biased a little bit? Because now you're asking an audience who has a certain moral already.
Well,
if you went to Africa, maybe you wouldn't get the same answer.
No, maybe you wouldn't, but I want that data anyway. I want all the data. I want to ask everybody all the questions. I know that's ambitious, but I really do. I want to ask everybody all the questions and find out, what does humanity think should happen to itself? Does every human being think that they shouldn't be murdered if they get caught murdering? Or is there a significant proportion of people who do think they should be murdered based on being caught murdering? But if you say what should happen to her, that's very biased, very clearly and automatically. There is no way to unbias that statement. The only way to clean that data of that white noise is to just focus on each individual and what they would have happen to them. And you're right, we still can't get rid of the bias completely, but at least we don't have bigotry and hatred and false beliefs and other things baked right into it, right? Which is what we get with this Pew data. Why do Republicans want to kill so many people? Well, it probably has something to do with their ideology, right? Why do Democrats not want to kill so many people? It's probably but that's their bias. It's all baked in. And it guarantees that you get that noise in the data when you ask somebody what should happen to somebody else. But it minimizes that white noise when you ask them, well, what should happen to you? And it just so happens that this room and most of the rooms that I present to don't want to be killed when they're found guilty of murder. But interesting note, the Death Penalty Information Center, that sounds interesting, pulls this data from people who are on death row. And as it turns out, 10% of them do think they should be killed for what they've done. 90% of them do not. So this is still, though, so we know that 90% of the time, if we kill somebody who's committed murder, we are being immoral. We're doing something they don't want done to them. We're causing suffering and they don't want to suffer in this way. Yes?
Well, I'm just wondering when they interview the inmates or whatever, what if they just don't want to die? And that's how they're answering. I just would rather live.
Of course.
Maybe it has nothing to do with, meta justice or something. Justice for them is just.
Well, we're not talking about justice, we're talking about science. And we have to ask people, do you want to be murdered, to determine should we murder people?
Yeah, in the question though, it's about, are they deserving of death, right? That was what they said they asked
The question that I asked was, if you were convicted of murder and you murdered somebody, should we kill you?
Right.
That's the
a different
question.
question from what you asked. You asked, do you want to be? Would you want to be? And then you just
Okay, well,
should
you could ask the same question a few different ways, but
Well,
do you want to be put to death if you're caught murdering?
Right, okay.
But that would be a different question from asking me, do you think you deserve it?
Right.
I don't want it, but do I deserve it? Yeah, I think under the situations I do. I don't want it, but
We could ask 20 different questions to figure out exactly what that person wants and needs and thinks and deserves.
yeah.
And we could still put it into the database and then query it to find out how we should behave towards them. But you're right, yeah, there's different ways these are moral questions. There's a lot of different ways we could ask them. But one of the things, interesting, if you follow true crime and you watch people getting interrogated by police, guilty people are often asked, well, what do you think should happen to somebody that does something like this? They don't know that they haven't confessed yet or whatever, but the cops are like, we're pretty sure it's this guy or this girl or whatever. What do you think should happen to people? And they go, oh, well, it shouldn't be that bad of a punishment, right? But when they say, well, what if somebody killed your kid? They'd go, well, I'd kill him. You know what I mean? Like, it's very easy to delve out death and punishment to those that you don't know or another group of people. It's very difficult to admit and own up to it yourself and claim and proclaim with any force or integrity that you should be killed. You yourself, right? So this is interesting. So let's run the experiment. We did an experiment in this room. We already know about physiological facts of humanity, right? So let's query the data. This is sort of an example of what we might do. So we've collected some data. And according to the objective moral facts, 100% of data returned demonstrates that human beings suffer when they're murdered. Right? Physiological fact. If you're murdered, you're dead and you've suffered because of it.
Again, I can't get that.
It's murder. Murder.
Right,
You didn't volunteer, you were murdered.
right, but.
It doesn't matter if I put you to sleep first and you feel no pain. You're dead. You have nothing to live. There's nothing about you. You're nothing anymore.
Yeah, but why is that suffering?
Yes, my sense.
So you're saying, let me just make sure, I'm going to kind of put this back at you. If murderers all just used a general anesthesia first and you didn't feel anything, then murder would be totally fine? I mean, it's still suffering, you're dead. You don't have any experience anymore. You can't live, you can't do anything.
You don't suffer after you're dead.
You know, like a
Well, you don't suffer after you're dead, but
What if,
all the science demonstrates that people don't want to die very generally, right? Like there are people that do want to die, and that's where we would get this subjective data. We'd say, okay, you're at this time in your life or whatever. Do you want to be put down? Do you want to die? And this is the death with dignity that we get, and so on and so on. And they usually want a general and then be put under. They want some sort of ease of pain and suffering. But murder isn't like that. And guess what?
well,
Murderers don't do that. Murderers don't put you to sleep and then nicely kill you. They murder you. They blunt force trauma your head like that child. So, I mean, I get you're wrestling with it and these are particulars, but let's not lose the fact that people actually die of blunt force trauma. And they get their throat slit and they get shot in the face and stuff like that. I get what you're saying, but as a general rule, 100% of people who are murdered suffer. That's what the data demonstrates. Show me the murderer that nicely puts you to sleep and then lays you down and then ends your life and everybody's super cool with that.
yeah, you could shoot them right there. They'd be,
Yep, that's what I was gonna say.
All right, we'll take that as a comment. Thank you.
yeah.
Sir?
I think part of it's the language of suffering that's causing the hang-up.
Oh, sure.
If you say
Absolutely.
flourish at one end and failure to flourish, of which an example is being murdered, that's failure to flourish. That's the way I would draw your.
Oh, sure. No, just do that in your head. Just pretend like that's what I
I'm
said.
suggesting
Whatever
that.
makes it easier for you to digest. No, I get it though. I'm not very articulate. I'm not a writer and certainly not a scientist. But okay, other than that murderer that nicely kills you, 100% of people that are murdered suffer, right? Other than that one exception.
But 100% of people who die suffer, right? In that sense.
Correct.
So like murder, the suffering is unrelated to whether it's willful or unwillful.
Well, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you suffer, yeah.
Well, I think what you're sort of getting at, I can hear it, is
So definition of
pointless
suffer, that's
suffering.
giving everybody a problem.
Needless or pointless suffering.
That's another way to say it, sure.
Yeah.
I don't think you need to, but you can.
It just sounds like a qualification of suffering that might be a little.
I do use that in the book a little bit, and
Okay.
I've dropped it. I don't know, I test out different ways to say things. That's part of why I'm doing the roundtables, because I want to hear people's reaction to suffering versus pointless or needless suffering or whatever. Suffering generally, though, well, let me finish the statement. We'll get there. We'll get to the end of the slide, hopefully. Furthermore, according to the subjective moral facts collected using the standard we've now assessed as the correct standard, death row inmates report that 90% of them do not want to be murdered. Thus, we can say that the death penalty is immoral. 100% of the time, objectively speaking, and 90% of the time, subjectively speaking. So that's very clear direction. If we ask, should we kill people that kill people? We query the data, we get objective facts, we get subjective facts, and we have very clear direction. And an answer, right? That sounds pretty definitive.
Well, it's like a sociological, like, if the majority of people millions of years ago thought that sacrificing animals was like the moral, ethical thing to do, they at that time would think it's absolute right and wrong. But like, how do we know it won't change? You know, it won't change for us 100 years down the way.
Well, generally speaking, though, we're not going to escape the facts of our biology. You know, we're never not going to be Homo sapiens. We're never not going to feel pain. We're never not going to have the same restraints and constrictions. And pardon me, you missed some of the first part. So some of this would have been covered, I think,
Okay.
for you. But for instance, we're never not going to be able to stop someone from breathing, and that act alone is going to cause suffering. We're never going to have that problem. I mean, I understand, like, from a philosophical perspective, people like to say things like, well, what happens if everything changes and the whole world is totally different and we all of a sudden aren't what we are? But we don't generally have that problem.
Right. I guess it's like.
And
some of the
scientifically
language-
speaking, we're never going to have that
Yeah.
problem.
Some of the language is very kind of absolutist.
And it's designed that way, absolutely.
Yeah, but it's based on social opinion.
No, it's not.
Right? Like,
No.
when you say data, you're talking about the polling of people's opinions?
Well, when I talk about subjective moral facts,
Uh-huh.
yes, I am saying that I'm taking their subjective experience of suffering and flourishing. But it's not that it's, when you say like their opinion, I don't love that terminology just
Right.
because someone's subjective account of their flourishing or suffering isn't really an opinion. I mean, it won't be your opinion that you're suffering if I do to you what the police officer did to George Floyd. You'll suffer and die.
Yeah.
And your account of that suffering won't be an opinion. It'll be your suffering. It's just your articulation. It's a subjective version, but it will be suffering. You won't ever be like, this is great, and now I'm dead. I mean, it's not going to change. It's a physiological fact that when somebody puts a knee on your neck, it's not going to feel good. You're going to go into a response that you can't even control of suffering. It'll be fight, flight, or freeze.
I guess just listening, it's difficult to tell when the fact is just social opinion. Just so far.
No, I understand. I think we cut through, maybe I'm wrong, maybe the rest of you can keep me honest here. I think we cut through a lot of that more in the beginning of the slides, where we were grounding all of this in science, and we were talking about objective facts and moral facts. But I could be mistaken.
But like social science. Or like when you
Well, it's a physiological, biological fact that you'll suffer if I stop you from breathing. If I put a ligature around your neck or whatever, you'll suffer and die. That's physiological. That's not social. But we can draw from the social sciences, and I think the social sciences like psychology and sociology and economics and such can greatly benefit from an active and directed and purposeful use of a science of morality to figure out how we should organize ourselves and how we should deal with, for instance, criminals. We've already sort of talked about that, like what should we do with people that murder people and so on. So I think those sciences have a lot to gain from this kind of purposeful moral science. So real quick, I'm getting really close to the end. I feel like I've been talking for a long time, and I have been. Human rights. Any good morality has human rights in it, right? You have to be able to demonstrate that you have human rights. Now this is going to be hard for some of you. Human rights are something largely that we have just said we have. And even scientists and philosophers and religious people have said, well, it's either given to us by God, or it's we've derived it from what the Bible told us, or we just say we have it. It's like an agreement that we have. Some people even say that it's given to us by our governments, or that we give it to each other. I grant you your right. But that can't be right. I mean, it's a right. What is a right if it's not something that you have? It's not granted to you. Let's explore this a little bit and try to figure out, where do these rights come from, and how can we actually use science to demonstrate that we have them? So let's get to that real quick. Oh, before I do really quick though, I just mentioned religion, and I mentioned sort of this paradigm. Largely, human rights is still stuck in a paradigm that we inherited from religion and philosophy. We've accepted that. And one of the goals of this book is to take things that we currently understand in one way and to make it into a science. And that's what I'm gonna walk you through that process right now. So if we look to biology and the biological definition of life, it has quite a few basic properties, right? And it doesn't apply to all life. Some life has other properties or whatever, but this is like generally life. This is as scientific as I need to get right now to demonstrate my point. But there's going to be things like capacity for growth, reaction to stimuli, metabolism, energy transformation, reproduction, and so on, right? There's also going to be things like homeostasis, being composed of cells, having a life cycle, being able to adapt to changes in environment, and evolving over many generations. Evolution, essentially, right? But if you look closely here, you can derive your right to bodily autonomy. And I'll show you how. So Interestingly, Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of already does that under physiological needs. If you look under physiological needs, Maslow nicely sort of summarized some of these for us. We need air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, and sex, although he says reproduction. I like sex. Let's now consolidate this list down to the bare essentials. Let's get rid of clothing, because clothing is just a derivative of shelter, right? It's redundant. And let's also remove sex. And we're just going to do it just for a minute, just because it takes special consideration. We evolved to need two people to reproduce. Therefore, we evolved to require consent. It's not your right to reproduce in the same way that it's your right to breathe. You must acquire, it requires consent, right? And so we're just going to table it just for a second, and we will get back to it. So with our new list, we have air, water, food, shelter, sleep, and I'm going to add in homeostasis, because we have to regulate. I borrowed that right from biology. Maslow didn't have it, but we have to be able to regulate. In other words, we have to be able to shit, right? You get pressure build up, and you have to let things out. You have to release. There's a lot of different ways in which you engage in homeostasis, but pooping is one of them. So we have everything here to demonstrate, first off, that we are alive, right? And these are the things that we maintain to stay alive. And we don't have a choice in this matter. You don't get to choose that you need air or water or food, or that you're going to metabolize, or that you're going to engage in homeostasis, or that you need to sleep. And so I would pose to you that a right is something you must do. You have no other choice. Because what is a right if it's not something that you have to do? How could you ever be expected not to? Who would ever come to you with some sort of elaborate philosophical argument that would convince anybody or in any way demonstrate that you don't need to do all of these things? And we don't need to grant you any of this. This doesn't need to be given to you by your government in the sense of like, it doesn't have to be written into a document just so that you have it. These are the facts of your biology. You will do these things. That is a guarantee. You evolved to do these things, and you had no choice in the matter. And I would put to you that that's what a right is. And when we take all of these things, there's one theme, and that's bodily autonomy. That's already a concept. It's easy to just usurp it and use it for my own wicked purposes, right? But putting things into and having things come out of my body, it's my choice, it's my right, it's my ability. I say choice, but I don't really have a choice. There are some choices that I make, but I will do these things, guaranteed. I don't have a choice. That must be my right then. Now, let's see. As kind of a tongue-in-cheek, I think we should be putting these rights into our documents in a way that makes them scientific. So this is sort of a fun little, as a well-regulated Homo sapiens being necessary to the security of humanity's right to bodily autonomy, the right of the people to homeostasis shall not be infringed. That sounds familiar, right? Some of you are familiar with the Second Amendment. I would propose to you that this might be a more interesting amendment. It has a lot of scientific terms in it. It tells me that I have a right to my bodily autonomy. Now, I didn't use the word bodily autonomy, or no, I did use it. I didn't even read my own thing. I did use the word bodily autonomy. Did you know that the words bodily autonomy and rights in the sense of scientific rights isn't anywhere in any of our documents? How did we write a document about humanity and fail to define what humanity is, how we know what a human is, what bodily autonomy is, and how we know we have that right? Now, if anybody ever asks you, well, why do you think you have a right to bodily autonomy? You can say, what other choice do I have? I must put things in and have things come out of me, and I must be the one to regulate that. any infringement upon these activities is immediate suffering. It's equivalent to the worst kind of suffering. And if you have any question about that, look up some of the cases of people that are being starved to death, or people that have been murdered in gas chambers. You take away any of these things and suffering is a guarantee. It's a physiological, biological fact. You make sure that these are clean and healthy and readily available, and people will thrive. Guaranteed. Every single time. There is no society under which these things are readily available and clean and for use that isn't thriving as far as these things are concerned. So I did say I'd get back to sex. I don't need to talk about it right now. I think it's enough. There's another presentation just about sex, because of course there is, right? But we did evolve to require consent. And so while it is part of our biology that we reproduce, I just want to put that as like a kind of final stamp on it. The right to somebody else's body is up to them to grant to you. And you don't have any kind of claim just because it's in our biological definition of life. And we can demonstrate that too. Anyway, this is my podcast and my YouTube channel. I put it on here before. I don't know if anybody even watches it or goes to it or whatever. That's just a goofy, I found that painting online that I kind of liked. Anyway, so that's how to get to it if you want to listen to more stuff that I do. But let's open it up. Let's open up the floor. I've been talking for way too long. I feel a little uncomfortable about that fact. How do you guys feel about what I talked about? Let's just open it up, please. Feel free to speak. Yes?
The one term that I like and I use a lot when I discuss such things as evidence that I did not hear used here is the term demonstrable evidence.
Oh, okay. Sure. I mean, I'm almost positive I said demonstrable, but no, noted.
Yeah, I might have missed it. But
Well, I'll put it in with more oomph next time,
Okay.
or maybe I'll repeat it more often. Because you're right. No, demonstrable is exactly part of it.
Okay.
It's part of the scientific method, and ultimately, if we're going to be skeptical, right, demonstration's required.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't demonstrate your belief or your thought or whatever you're proposing, your claim, then why should I believe you?
Right.
Yeah. Otherwise, I'm not just going to trust. This isn't about faith. It's about demonstration. So good point, though. Thank you.
And then the other thing, early on, you talked about subjective morality.
Yes.
I think the same thing of faith.
In what context?
That it, I don't know how to quite say it now.
It's both.
You can't determine who's right in an argument with subjective morality.
Right. Correct.
You can't do it with faith either.
Correct.
That's what I was trying to say.
You need demonstration.
Yep.
Yeah. That's exactly why I think a lot of people want to be able to. I kind of said that at the beginning. It's like people want morality to be subjective, I think largely because they don't want to be demonstrated to be immoral. And that forces us to look in the mirror and go, oh my God, I did something immoral. I mean, it's demonstrable. I can't deny it. But it definitely hinders our path towards moral conclusions, I think, in the same way that trying to do it based on faith would do the same thing. Yeah. Sir?
I'd like to be redundant and repeat again.
Please.
I think you need to change suffering as I know that's a big deal, but I would argue that failure to thrive is better.
Sure.
And let me give you an example of a place where a large fraction of the human population now on morality thinks that the afterlife is where you have the least suffering.
Sure.
You have the most good. And so, but they don't say that's where you have a failure to thrive. You can't thrive in that situation.
Sure.
But martyrdom and all the wonders that come from the afterlife is, I think suffering is a term and a description. I'm certainly in favor of what we're trying to do. I try to do it myself.
Sure.
In many ways.
Good on you.
But I would encourage you to think very carefully about whether suffering is that end of that spectrum that you started with me in the middle, suffering on this end, and thriving on this end. I think if you say failure to thrive, you're going to make more progress.
Well, there might be a distinction to be made in the book. There might be a reason to pause on that and talk about suffering versus failure to thrive, or to further break it down into more granular, more detail. Yeah, this is very summarized. The book is very not. It's very detailed. But anyway, yes, sir.
I'd say that one would probably actually be good, thrive versus failure to thrive, because when I was looking at flourishing and I'm thinking, well, if you get plenty of food, you don't feel hungry, that's kind of flourishing, but then if you get fat and unhealthy, that was too much flourishing, you didn't do well. But thrive necessarily includes, you know, the healthiness, the, you know, best condition of whatever it is that's thriving.
Yeah.
It's not merely flourishing. And then you would also have the sort of a graded decrease to failure to thrive like you should, failure to thrive at all. So it just sounds like a term that is a little easier to scale.
And it is in medical literature, that phrase, failure to thrive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For, especially
Very
for
much.
the developmental stages of children.
Yeah, no, and that's that's a good point, yeah. And it's all worth the going through. Having this discussion, just the little bits that we're hashing out right now is all worth it, right? This is all valuable stuff that we would want to include, so all good stuff. You look like you were going to say something, did I?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate your efforts in wrapping more science around morality.
Indeed.
I think it needs to be done. Mike Grant gave a talk a few months back on the evolution of morality, showing how it's evolved. He's a biologist.
Sure.
And showing how it's evolved over the millennia as a benefit for species, right? And anything that can be done to put more science around that, whether it's evolutionary connection or what you're doing, I think is a great thing, because religion has claimed the patents to that for way too long. You know?
Yeah, I think
And
religion
it's
and philosophy.
We wouldn't be, how would we know not to kill each other weren't it for a book that, you know, tells us we're gonna suffer
Right.
if we do that, you know, if we do something bad.
And my question is, how do we demonstrate that we shouldn't kill each other? You know? Yeah. And but I think
Failure to thrive.
that's a big driver of why I wrote the book, is because I wanted to bring it from a more traditional, historic. In religion, it's sort of an edict. It's something that's given to us by a higher power, and that clearly isn't right, and it doesn't work, and we can't demonstrate any of that. But then in philosophy, it's just largely fancy. Like, a lot of it is just sort of what I think. So there's like the Stoics, and then there's, you know, the utilitarians, and there's all these proposed options and solutions, but there isn't a direct path based on evidence. And so that's what I wanted to usurp all that information and drive it into the ground with evidence and say, okay, we need to actually come to the conclusion. And it doesn't matter if you're a Stoic or utilitarian or deontological. It doesn't matter if you're Christian or, you know, Muslim or Jewish or whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is can you demonstrate the veracity and the, you know, your claim? Can you demonstrate that you're a moral person, or that your system is moral, or, you know, that your document, your governmental constitution or whatever, can you demonstrate that that's moral? That kind of thing. And I really want to drive that into the very foundation of those types of, you know, law, and we're passing laws and we're putting in social systems and so on. A lot of it's based on, I mean, some of it's based on what the Bible says. Some of it's based on what people think is okay. What can you demonstrate is going to benefit humanity and so on. So, and maybe not just the billionaires. Maybe there's a demonstration for everybody, you know, that works for all of us, not just the people that can afford to clean air before they breathe it, so to speak. But yeah, is there any other feedback? You guys have been kind of quiet. Is there anything you want to say? No?
I have another question for you.
Yeah, please.
This is a loaded question.
Okay.
Are you vegan?
No.
How do you rationalize the meat production industry? How does that reconcile into your worldview?
I have to do the science and figure it out. I'm not happy about
What
it.
about suffering of animals?
Yeah, no, I'm not happy about it. I don't want animals to suffer.
But they do.
It's away from
On the biggest scale, the scale of human suffering in the meat industry is beyond all the suffering of humanity combined since we've
Perhaps,
existed.
But that
Oh,
still
trillions and
takes
trillions
it
of
out
animals die. And don't think I'm vegan, because I'm not.
I didn't say you were.
I call myself an aspiring vegetarian. You know, I still.
I want a viable option. I would,
Yeah.
and I have like tried to support viable options to meat production, and personally couldn't stick to the diet, but
Right.
it's
Yeah, it's a hard one to crack.
it's as
a
hard as I
one.
can push right now, and I keep research. I have like vegan Tuesdays and vegan Thursdays, and there were times when I was doing like,
It's a start.
you know, days of the week, months at a time, and years at a time. But no, I mean, here's the thing though. The only way to solve that is through science and engineering, and there's no other option. And we have to drive towards that goal. We are at like, this is the same with the prison system, and it's the same with meat production, right? It's a system based on suffering. It's a system that has it baked into it.
Yeah.
So we know it's not a moral stopping point. It's a pause at best. And as much as we can engineer our way out of it using science and technology and reason and all the moral science, we should be doing that, and we're not. Nobody's meaningfully trying to figure out another way to humanely house murderers and psychopaths and child molesters.
Oh, yes, they are.
Most people are happy to have them suffer.
Yeah, but there are people who've worked out a more humane way.
Well, sure, and good on them. But this is not sweeping the world as a moral
Right.
truth and absolute. I mean, this is small, tiny pockets of success in an otherwise abysmal track record of treating people horribly. And the same goes for cows and lambs and chickens, and you know what I mean? And we have a real answer that we know we need to get to, and in any meaningful sense, we're kinda not. I mean, yes, there are people that are like engineering alternatives to meat and so on, but I mean, it's largely left up to the economy, and there's all kinds of, there's all kinds of propaganda for and against and all this other stuff. Well, what does the evidence demonstrate is what I'm curious about and what I want to drive towards. And so the policy would be based on the evidence, not on our fancy. Now, it is true though that we evolved to have these tastes. That is going to be really hard to work our way around. I mean, no science can do it, but if you've ever tried to just eat fake meat for any real length of time, it becomes a very difficult endeavor.
Not for me.
Well, good for you.
I've
Yeah.
graduated to Beyond Meat and Impossible Burgers.
Yeah, I attempted the same, and I just had there was a limit. I was like almost gagging, and it's just how it works. And I keep it in my freezer, and I incorporate it into my meals, and I try to wean off everything I can. And it's because of the science. It's because I understand that they're suffering, and that can be demonstrated. So I'm using the science to try and be better.
Yeah.
But just to be clear too, there are some practices that we may not ever stop doing out of necessity. It may be, for instance, that diesel-powered combines are the only real way to produce food at the scale that we need. Now, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just pulling something out of thin air, just as an example. We may convert every other form of power production away from fossil fuels except for that one, out of necessity. But driving towards what we know to be the right answer because we did the scientific analysis, the science that I'm suggesting we do, it is worth the doing. And we may come to conclusions that we can't resolve at this time, another pausing point until the technology catches up or whatever, but do you understand what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, but
we
as long
want
as-
to drive that way either way, and welcome to the world. We're going to be hypocritical for a while, some
As
of us.
long as we're chipping away at the mountain of suffering that's out there. Right?
And in a meaningful
And it
way.
is a mountain.
Yeah. There's no shortage. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I personally, I don't think there's anything immoral with eating meat because it's part of nature. Other animals cannot exist if they didn't eat meat. The moral question is how that animal is treated before it's killed.
There's a nuance there worth exploring for sure. I'm not sure though that just because this is how we evolved, that it makes it moral. I'm not sure that I'm willing to concede that point.
We're just part of nature.
I think that's called the naturalistic fallacy, and I think it does work in that direction. I think it can be misapplied in other applications, but I do think that, for instance, just because, for instance, I evolved to have a very sensitive part of my body very readily available and exposed to the world in a very kickable location. I would prefer that that wasn't the case, but just because I evolved that way doesn't make that optimal or moral. There are other people who evolve to have other things that put them in jeopardy and cause them suffering and pain. And that doesn't mean that it has to remain that way or that we shouldn't try to alleviate that pain and suffering. Just because it evolved into us doesn't mean we have to accept it as the answer and the moral solution. As a matter of fact, and very, again, kind of generally speaking, science has been the key to easing so much of our inherited pain, suffering, and immorality. I mean, birth control has been a monster in alleviating the immoral fact that some of us get pregnant and some of us do not. That was not our choice. We didn't have any say in that. We didn't have any say in the fact that we must have sex to procreate. We didn't get to choose any of this. That's just what happened. That's how we evolved. But thanks to science, we've been able to give people a moral solution to the facts of their biology. Does that make sense? Like, I'm not convinced, in other words, I'm not willing to concede that just because we evolved to eat meat doesn't mean that we should continue to do it, and it doesn't mean we should not try to find a better solution, one that doesn't involve suffering. But it is true, we did evolve to eat meat. I have teeth that are very specifically evolved to chew on meat, for sure, guaranteed. This is great stuff. You guys are really taking this well. Some people get really pissed off, other people yell at me. I had one guy raise his hand and say something horrible about that child I showed you. I mean, there were some interesting responses. So this is great stuff.
What did he
Please, feel
say
free.
about the child?
He said, how do we know that he didn't deserve that?
Oh, wow.
And it is horrible.
I agree.
Well,
Somebody ought to go look
ask,
at his household.
but I gotta be honest with you. That response or that question isn't really all that. I kind of get where he's coming from. I don't agree with him, and I would never say anything like that. But if you're an armchair philosopher and you think it's possible for everybody to have their own morality, and you think that suffering might be required just so that you can have flourishing, or this sort of yin-yang idea where in order to have good, you have to have the bad, or whatever, right? If you come from a certain place and you posit a question like that, I kind of get what you're saying. I just wish you hadn't said it. Like, I wish you had thought for another 30 seconds and thought, that's a beaten child, obviously, and I'm not going to say anything that might suggest that we shouldn't care and that we shouldn't stop that behavior and that that's not, you know what I mean? That's would have been my preference for him. But on their path from where they are to where we need them to be, morally speaking, some people are going to have to jump quite a large chasm. It's not going to be easy for everybody, and some people are going to have a real difficulty squaring morality. And some of them are going to say and think really bad things. And I don't see it as that rare. I am repulsed by it, just like the room was. And everybody was like, Jesus Christ, what is this guy talking about? And I kind of pushed him and held him to the fire a little bit, but I let him go a little bit too, because we have to convince people like that is suffering, and that's worth using science to alleviate, and to educate, or whatever it is that would solve that. We have to use science and drive towards that solution as quickly and as efficiently as possible, as directly as possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
I was just thinking, I find a little bit of a confusion sometimes between the difference between philosophy and science. I think sometimes
Indeed.
when like psychoanalysts, they think about like why someone believes in God, like they
Sure.
because they need an authority, like Sky Daddy, right? It's I need something that's absolutely correct, and and I desire that. It gives me security.
Yeah.
It feels good to believe 100% that it's infallible. And so when I can imagine someone maybe thinking about the way you're using the word science, and in some of the language like ironclad, that what's going on beneath the surface is an appeal to this higher, maybe nebulous, abstract idea of science, and science being like rational arguments, testing, which to me seems similar to philosophy, is also just rational talk about, it just doesn't deal with something like a deity or something, like something you can't see, or a meta consciousness. So I would wonder if once your book comes out, if that, and you tour it or you go on podcast circuit and all that stuff, people would say, well, you're talking about science, but even science is sort of like not absolute. It's sort of like this is what the evidence suggests so far. We learned that in COVID times. It was like they were doing the best, but is perfection out there? I mean, do we, like it's an evolved, like there isn't quite an absolute, even though it feels good to have like science is going to tell us this absolute morality. It feels like we're still almost, I could see like it's engaging a part of us that really desires for that parent figure that has all the power and all the authority that we had when we were kids, and we just are all starving for that because the world is chaotic, and things happen. So like, I don't know, that's what I see a little bit when there's such this like, science will save us,
You think it's a little bit like philosophy in that it won't save us, or that it doesn't have any basis, or it's a little bit like religion in the sense that we want it to save us in this all-powerful kind of way? Is that what you're suggesting? I'm just curious.
I guess that that the science will somehow give us like this unrefutable, for all time, permanent ethical code, when we have like hundreds and hundreds of years of seeing different cultures, different societies, once technologies are introduced. Even this idea of like veganism, like is suffering like, a pinnacle of what morality is, or like is suffering just intrinsic to life? Like no matter what, we're gonna step on grass, we're gonna step on bugs. To exist is to cause suffering to someone else. So like, we suffer always. We always will kind of suffer. In fact, sometimes if you don't suffer, that's where you get into trouble the most, sometimes. I don't know, it seems like complex, pretty complex, and to have, if some of the science is from like Pew Research or just kind of opinion, I mean, I said that word opinions, but
No,
this is what I feel like people
the
are gonna
subjective
make.
moral data that I collect and suggest that we should collect can be called opinion.
I mean,
that's not unscientific though if I collect it in the right way and apply it and aggregate it in a scientific way.
And even like the founding documents you mentioned for like the US, there was like a wisdom of those founders to know like, we don't know what good will look like, a more perfect union in the future, so we're gonna add this system of amendments where the people can vote. Like, I guess we were wrong to have women not be able to vote. And like that's worked as this living, it still is just an agreement of people saying, we all agree to be civil and we're all, I mean, this is we vote and the majority wins, hopefully, like, or like, and hopefully, but if the majority is immoral, then like immorality kind of wins, right? And
Indeed, yeah.
But the beauty of that was that we can't force people, and that we get to use our.
Well, to be clear though, we do force people.
Well,
we force the minority to do what the majority says. So if you want your rights to bodily autonomy in certain states, you aren't going to get them.
That's right.
If you're a woman.
Right.
And that was the majority implementing and forcing the minority. So it's a vehicle to force people to do what they don't want to do.
But they consent to live in the U.S. Like
No, they don't. No, you are born into the U.S. under no fault of your own.
Right, but like if you go to the border, they're not going to say you can't walk out of here. Right? Like
It depends on which border and which
to be a citizen is to agree.
Assuming you have the resources to get to the border, and I mean, okay, let me just give you my thoughts based on what you've said so far.
Please.
You're pointing out that this is incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And that there is a lot of things that we need to learn. And there's a lot of places to apply the science that I'm suggesting that we apply. And I agree with you. I would encourage you not to get overwhelmed with the complexity as much as to try and simplify the science in the same way that we, for instance, simplify all scientific models. The models that we generate in science are generally incredibly simplistic compared to the actual reality of the science that we're dealing with. So the science of cosmology and Big Bang and biology and abiogenesis and all of this are very simplistic models in comparison to the actual complexity of what we're trying to resolve or what we're trying to understand. And I would just encourage you to look at it in that way and recognize, yes, the breadth and depth is staggering, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't get down to the hard work of sciencing the shit out of it. And that doesn't mean that this is futile. It shouldn't be a fatalist conclusion that because it's so vast and because it's so big, I don't know, I can't, we won't, let's not. It should be, yep, and let's pick a very specific aspect of it and get that science in there and figure out what's going on and find out what model we can start to apply and then get that model into peer review. See who can demonstrate that we're false. See if we can withstand the onslaught of the scientific process and that method. But I would also say that I commend you for being open-minded enough to be thinking about all these different aspects. I mean, some people can barely see past their own faces. So it's very important what you're bringing up, and we have to be engaging in it in a very mindful and thoughtful and elaborate way, but not to the detriment of the science. It's not a fatalistic conclusion. It's not, oh my God, the moon's so far away and there's so much involved and we have all this math to solve, let's not go to the moon. That's gonna be fucking hard. What's step number one? How can we simplify this to get our brains wrapped around just the part where we propel off the planet? Escape speed. Okay, let's just focus on that. How do we get to escape speed? Or what? It's not velocity. Escape velocity. Thank you. Sorry, I'm not a scientist. But how do we get to, how do we engineer a thing that can go that fast? Where do we put it? I guess Houston. That sounds like a good idea, right? Where do we put this stuff, right? Like, how do we do it? Like, do you understand my point? Like, I get what you're saying,
I
but
just think some people might say, like,
and they
it's
do.
like a book that's like, it's an answer looking for the questions, and the answer is science.
Correct.
And that the whole book is meant to just find a way to say science.
I do have answers in the book, though. I mean, this is a summary, so we can solve abortion readily and easily with science, hard data, right now. But go ahead.
Just step into this, and I think it's what you're talking about. Conclusions that you get from, say, a science of morality aren't necessarily all going to be ironclad. It's got some, the way I like to put it is in science, physicists tend to think of themselves as in a real hard science. They can come up with absolutes. Magnetism behaves this way, bam. You don't have to like it, it just does. I'm a biologist. We have what you refer to sometimes as a squishy science. Not just because our stuff is squishy, but cells behave certain ways, but it's not too hard to suddenly find the culture that was a monoculture suddenly doing something weird. So, it's got a lot more variability. When you get into the social sciences, they can come up with some pretty good conclusions, but now they're starting to have more variability. Psychological sciences, the way these things work in any individual, if you're bipolar, you're not going to be the same as that person who's bipolar. So there's more, there's sciences that are more hard and definable, and sciences that are more broad and squishy is the word I like.
Sure.
And I think a moral science is going to fit into the broad squishy one. You're not always going to have a real hard line. This is how you behave in every circumstance, and there's no objections, and all you have to do is, read the book, and there's my answer. It's going to be squishier than that.
No, I think the answer that I have to that, though, is the science is worth doing. Let's get to the science and find out how squishy it is.
Yeah,
I'm not sure it is squishy. I don't even know if it's hard or squishy, or if it's really that complex or not. I don't know.
Yeah.
Let's do it and find out. And if it does end up being hard or squishy or difficult or whatever, we'll handle that. We've handled that before. And it just means we have to do more of it, and we have to do it with better tools, or we have to invent better tools. I mean, physics was kind of squishy for a while until they invented some decent tools to actually see into the cosmos, right? I mean, before we knew anything about Big Bang cosmology, it was really squishy past a certain time and space, right? I mean, we didn't know anything about what was going on out there, but now we know a ton because we invented the right tool.
And it's getting
And
more
they're all-
squishy.
And they're all like that
Perhaps.
because the psychological sciences, bipolar initially wasn't even a diagnosis.
No, I follow you.
And then now they've got bipolar 1 and 2, and still people don't always behave the same, but they keep researching it and trying to get, okay, now we understand why these people behave differently, so we've got two classes we can treat a little better.
Sure.
And, you know, so it's squishy, but you can still keep refining it till it's less squishy. And I think a moral science be the same thing. If you're gonna do it, initially, it's probably is gonna be pretty squishy, because it's a baby science.
Well, there's a
And
lot
then
of
as
good
you
stuff
go
though that's
along-
pretty hard. If I
And
put
there
my
may
knee
be-
on your neck for 9 minutes, you'll die.
Yeah, there are gonna
That's
be
pretty hard. I don't think there's any question. There's no squish there other than your neck. Like, if I murder you, you'll die. You know what I
there are
mean?
gonna
Like,
be-
there are some squishy aspects to it. Like, should we eat meat, or have we scienced our way out of vegan or out of being carnivorous or whatever? But there's also some really hard aspects to it. So I get your point. I just would.
Well, and it's ditto with
To
psychology.
the
and
degree to which
sociology.
it leads to fatalism in the sense of, well, it's so difficult or it's so squishy, I don't know that we could even do it, is the degree to which I would say, pump the brakes on that and let's get to the part where we do the science first and then draw some conclusions. Maybe there are some impossibilities. For instance, in space travel, there are some frontiers that we will never overcome. We're never going to escape our gravitational neighborhood, and I can't remember the name of that, but it's like our local group.
Solar system?
No,
Heliosphere or
The
cloud.
heliosphere.
no, not our specific. I'm talking about our local group. All of the
Galactic.
gravitationally bound galaxies in our little space are all the further we could ever go, because outside of that local group, everything's moving away from us at such a speed that it, at least at present, it's impossible. It's never been demonstrated that we could even conceive of a way. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but
Right.
it's never been demonstrated to be possible as of right now. But anyway, that's just one of those things. Let's get to the part where we know the science so well that we know what we can and can't do and how we are going to do things. Would just be my thing. I'm certainly
Well, yeah, you
interested in the squish, but not to the detriment of the science, of the
No.
actual step 1 or 2 or 3. And if,
Yeah.
in
It's
this
building blocks.
in this
It's
room, it
building
doesn't
blocks.
seem to be a problem, but in a lot of groups I talk to, it's just, why even try? People are like, who would ever, I just want to go watch TV. You know what I mean? Like, they just
Oh,
want to
no,
throw up their
no.
hands and say it's too hard.
That's like the
And I get-
science
I
of
get that too.
aeronautics.
Yeah.
People thought it was not.
So let's wrap it up,
Wow.
folks.
Yeah, we have a
I at least
5
want
minutes.
Yeah.
to shut the camera down. Paul, thank you for the talk and
Thank
everything.
you so much.
And-
What a pleasure.
Yeah.